be truthful, I was always a little confused about prayer when I was growing up. I'd always heard there was a certain way to do it, and I had kind of adapted it to my particular understanding of what that meant. So I had a certain ritual, a certain pattern that when I went to bed that I would follow. And I always began, and I thought I'd learned this way of praying from church, but I always began with what I would call the buttering up phase, right? God, you're awesome, you're great, you're a great God, things are amazing, thank you, God. And then I would have that part of my prayer, which was called the suggestion box. Now, I would say, you're a great God, and I would pray and say, thank you, God, please watch over my mom, my dad, my teachers. But the suggestion box was a point at which I would ask God for certain things. Watch over my parents, watch over my teachers. Can I trade my sister in for a new puppy? It was kind of certain suggestions, and the amount of suggestions usually were related to that sense of the buttering up phase. Now again, this is as a little kid, was kind of how I understood prayer. And eventually, as I lay in bed, as I sat there in silence, my words would stop, and I'd sit there and listen. And sometimes, I swear, I would hear laughter. Years later, as a teenager, I read a great little book in the 70s by a pastor priest named Matthew Fox. It was called On Becoming a Magical Mystical Bear. Spirituality, American Style. And you might think it a book of fluff, by the title, but actually there were some really interesting ideas that really challenged how I thought about prayer. The first thing Fox asserted was that the reality is, in our American religious culture, in our society, we've never grown up out of our ideas about what prayer is. That we have a very childish understanding of prayer. Kind of God is the vending machine. I insert the right coin, the right prayer, I pull the right lever, and out pops the outcome I want. And Fox says we need to grow up in our understanding about prayer. And he asserts that prayer really is a radical response to life. Prayer is essentially being human and engaging in life and experiencing kind of two things that are part of our human experience. It is experiencing the joy of being alive, the reverence for that, the gifts of it, that sense of celebration we might use through words or songs or poems. But he also says prayer contains within it a sense of human suffering. A sense that we can look at ourselves and look out at the world and we can see it's not what we expect or what we'd hope for. That a more adult understanding of prayer holds those two things in tension, the joy and the suffering. These days, I still think we as a culture, a religious culture, have a kind of childish understanding of prayer. These days, what passes as a kind of adult religious approach is kind of a little bit of the health and wealth gospel. If you don't ask God, you're not going to get it. Kind of the old idea, oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? And we see that all around us. We see it preached at mega churches by evangelists on TV. But if you don't ask for God's blessing, don't ask God to increase your life, it won't happen. The converse effect is, well, then I don't get it because I didn't say the right words, or I didn't have enough faith, or I didn't do the right things to get from God what I asked. I never got a puppy. Yet somehow that's still a part of how a number of Christians think about prayer. As childish as that is. And it puts the blame when we don't get what we want on our lack of faith, or that we didn't do the right things or say the right words or have the right pastor pray for. How many of you have heard of Rabbi Harold Kushner? Anybody here heard of Rabbi Harold Kushner? His story is he was a rabbi, Orthodox rabbi leading a temple, and he had a very tragic thing happen. His son, his child, had, I don't even know the name of the disease, but he had this disease where you grow old before your time. It's a very strange genetic kind of disease. And so he lost his child, that tragedy of that. And he struggled with his faith because he had prayed, please save my child. We can imagine how difficult, how powerful the yearning is that he prayed, please save my child. And he found people tried to comfort him by saying things like, well, God probably wanted your son with God. And Rabbi Kushner said, that wasn't a comfort. I was mad at God that God didn't change this. So he wrote this small little book, a beautiful book, as he struggled to understand why his child, his son, why this horrible thing had happened to his son and to his family. And he didn't title the book, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. He didn't title it that because he said we live in a world where that's a mystery. We cannot explain in this world why those broken things happen, why death happens, why we struggle with understanding why children die, why there's such suffering and hunger. We cannot fully explain that. But he did title the book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, because he does say that while God won't answer our question about why, his experience in prayer is God will be there in the midst of that pit, sharing your journey. And that's enough. Jonah is in the belly of the whale, or the big fish. He is in darkness. He has run away as fast as he could from God, and yet now he's trapped. And what does he do? I think what all of us would do, he prays. And I love some of the phrases that he uses. He describes being the waters closing over him, the flood, the deep surrounding him, weeds wrapped around his head, that he feels lost and alone, his life ebbing away. He is in the throes of deep despondency and brokenness. And yet he reaches out in prayer to connect to God. And what's interesting, if you look at that ancient, centuries-old prayer, is he doesn't ask God to do anything. He doesn't make a suggestion or ask that God save him from the pit. He just acknowledges that he's there. And he still has the faith, the trust that even at the Hebrew word is Sheol, they're understanding a metaphor for the pit of death where they feel so cut off. And yet even there, he says and prays his trust that God will find him. Anne Lamott, a little small book, just in the past 5 or 6 years on prayer called Wow. No, it's called Help, Thank You, and Wow. 3 essential words, she says, of what it is to pray. And I want to cite for you some of the things that she has kind of our down-to-earth, very earthy way of talking about spirituality. And for her, prayer, she says, is encountering the real. That prayer is the only time, in many ways, that we can be totally honest about who we are and our struggles. She says, when you're telling the truth, you're connecting to God. If you say, I'm exhausted and depressed beyond words, and I don't like you, God, at all right now, that might be the most honest thing you've ever said. And she says, if you told me you had said to God, it's all hopeless, and I don't have a clue if you exist, but still I could use a hand, that would bring tears to my eyes, she says. So prayer is our sometimes real selves trying to communicate with the real, the truth, the light. It's us reaching out to be heard, hoping to be found by a light and warmth in the world instead of the darkness and the deep we feel surrounded by. That prayer really is that time when everything is stripped away in our illusions, in our sense of control, in our judgments, in our anger, in our unwillingness to forgive, that somehow forgive others and ourselves, but yet somehow real prayer is when we're in the belly of the fish and we know all we have is God there with us. The realness of God. Not some image, not some fake belief about God, but the realness of God. But you can only see the light if you're willing to enter the darkness. It's a kind of grown-up idea about prayer, isn't it? What we often forget is that even in the midst of that darkness, God gives us gifts that sustain us. There's a story, I'm sure many of you have heard it, about a man who was in a town that began to be flooded, so he climbed up on his roof, and he starts crying out to God. He says, God, please save me. Please save me from drowning. And pretty soon, a guy in a rowboat kind of rows by and says, hop in, I'll take you out of here and you can be saved. And the man says, no, God will save me. Then finally, a motorboat came by and a man says, jump in, I'll get you out of here. He says, no, I know God will save me. And finally, a helicopter flies by. The water is climbing higher and higher. The helicopter says, we'll throw you a ladder down there. You can climb in. And he says, no, I know God will save me. Right? So what happens? The man dies, and he goes to heaven, and he says, God, why didn't you save me? And God says, well, I sent you a rowboat, a motorboat, a helicopter. What else can I do? God's sending us rowboats, motorboats, helicopters all the time, even as we're sitting in Sheol, in the pit of darkness. And we just don't notice. It might be a rowboat of a loved one willing to hold our hand, care for us. It might be a motorboat of a community of friends who care for us, even as we are in our brokenness and uncertainty. God sending gifts every day. We just don't see them. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.